Beamish and Crawford Brewery, or the Cork Porter Brewery as it was called, opened for business January 1792. And it was William Beamish and William Crawford were two merchants of the city. They weren't brewers, and they came together with two brewers who had a brewery over on Wansford Quay in 1791 and bought the site behind us here. And there was a brewery on the site already owned by a man called Aylmer Allen, who had died. And even going back about 200 years before that, there was a history of brewing on the site. Small little breweries really, but it was when Beamish and Crawford took over and opened their Cork Porter Brewery, that's when brewing began in earnest, not only in Cork but in Ireland as well. And in the 1700s, porter as a drink, what we call stout today I suppose, had become very popular in Britain, in the cities. It was imported into Ireland in huge quantities, and by the 1790s taxes and so on, regulations had changed so that it was commercially viable for Irish people to start brewing on a commercial basis. Beamish and Crawford saw the opportunity, dived in, and were incredibly successful very quickly. They grew to be Ireland's biggest brewery. They were bigger than Guinness until about the late 1830s. They were as big as any of the great London porter breweries like Whitbreads and Truman's, which were so famous. They had agents in the big cities in Britain. They exported to the Caribbean. They exported to the east coast of America. They had contracts for supplying the British fleet. They were a really, really successful commercial company. The Napoleonic Wars from 1793 to 1815, huge boom time for brewing and provisions like commodities like beef and pork and oatmeal. Porter, of course, as well. Beamish cashed in on that. But Battle of Waterloo 1815, that ended the war, and that was a big blow to the economy, the agricultural economy in Ireland, and the brewery suffered as well. So it went into a decline, but came back up again in the 1850s, and so it carried on for the next 200 plus years until it eventually closed in 2009, sadly. So it ended up that Heineken in Cork, brewing Murphy's, also owned Beamish and Crawford. It wasn't commercially viable to keep two breweries going in the city, so brewing was finished here at Beamish and Crawford and moved to the Heineken brewery, the Murphy brewery on Leitrim Street. And Beamish Stout is still brewed there, same recipe, same methods, same care, same love, same affection, same heritage, same history. So you can still go out there and drink your pint of Beamish and, you know, drink in that 200 plus years of Beamish and Crawford heritage. Now, as you can hear behind us and as you can see probably, there's a lot of activity on the site now 9 years later after the closure, because the site is being developed as the so-called brewery quarter, and we're to have an event centre, I hope, and I hope that the site is regenerated tastefully, and that it again will be a kind of a significant part of the economy and the infrastructure and the life of Cork City. The drinks trade in Cork was very much different to the rest of Ireland, because a peculiar feature of the drinks trade in Cork was the tied house system, and that's where breweries who brewed the beer also owned or controlled the pubs, and then a pub that was owned by a specific brewery was allowed to trade only in the products of that brewery. So if you went into a pub, you either got all Beamish products, you went into another pub, it was all Murphy's. There was very little crossover. And Barrack Street, drink was regarded differently. Today maybe there's lots of negative connotations sometimes, even though we all enjoy a pint. But go back to the 19th century, early 20th century, having a couple of pints of porter was part of the working man's daily diet. Most work was physical, whether it was carting or lifting or working on the docks, labouring. That's what made up the vast majority of work for men in the city, and women as well. And their pint in the morning before work, their couple of pints in the middle of the day and in the evening was part of their nourishment. Okay, yes, they might have got a bit of a buzz out of it, but they got certain, essential vitamins and nutrients and all that as well, because their diet was very limited. And say Barrack Street, for example, had 26 pubs in 1900. I think it's only about 6 or 7 now. And every one of those pubs was tied. Most of them were tied to Beamish, because on the south side of the city, Beamish controlled most of the trade. Barrack Street, I suppose, was lucky in many ways in that it was located so close to the brewery, or the brewery located so close to Barrack Street. And a lot of the people who worked in the brewery would have come down every morning for their shift, walking down Barrack Street as they did to other locations in the city. It would have been important for the pub trade. As I mentioned, there was 26 pubs on the street. Every one of those pubs was giving a living to a family and maybe to other people working in the pub. You had the carters, the draymen who left the brewery every day and did the deliveries. So up Barrack Street Street from Southgate Bridge every day. You'd have the trucks going up with the wooden barrels on the back and delivering to all of those 20 plus pubs. So they were employed there as well. You would have had, say, barley coming in from outside the city, and remember Barrack Street Band Road was one of the main arteries into the city, right up into the 20th century. So that would have been a very busy thoroughfare as well, with people coming in to the city. You also had the drovers, the men with the cattle, where they keep the cattle out by the lock before they're brought in. So it would have been an absolute hive of activity. Marketing, as it was called, like people selling stuff on the street outside of shops, huge part of the activity, and those people were noted for their high consumption of porter as well.
Now, if you go up further again to where the Brown Derby is now, you will notice there's a little cul-de-sac there at the time. Now, that was important because in the late 19th century, Barrack Street became an important marketing area. And one of the four markets was on that particular site. That was the apple market. So they would come in there about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, 2 or 3 times during the apple season. And there were all stalls there. They lay out all their different type of apples, and they would be. What would happen then before the traders would come? They'd all have gone to the local pub, all of which got extensions to open on the market morning. So they'd have a pint or two there and a bit of a breakfast, and then they'd start mostly selling off at about 8 o'clock in the morning. So if you were a trader then, if you wanted apples for your shop, you went along, you bought so much of this, so much of that, and so much. If you were an ordinary householder, you did the very same thing. Your apples were there too. You could buy a bag for 3pence or 4pence and so forth.
So it was, I suppose, it was the brewery, the drinks trade, the pubs, the labourers, the workers. The whole thing was kind of woven together in a kind of a tapestry, I suppose, all connected with nearly everybody's life in the city.
If you went further up the street then, to where Reed's Place is now. Now you had you had 2 markets together there. You had the potato market and the fish market. Across from the road then you had the Fort Market, where Mr. Paddy Murphy and his family are there now. They have the coal store and the potato business. You will notice that on the wall, just to the right of the main entrance, there's a large stone plaque, and on it you'll find written on it St. Finbar's Market, and then the particulars about the milk underneath it. Now the same happened there. All the milk people, and Cork was a great milk district, as was Douglas as well. It was mostly Protestant families who lived there. They were notable for milk production, for high quality milk.
Barrack Street was a vibrant street, plenty of shops. I think there was about nearly 60 shops. There was about 17 or 18 public houses. There was 4 chemist shops. You had Broderick's, Carroll's, Matthew Thomas and O'Regan's. There were 2 undertakers, Russell's and the one Ford's in Kaiser's Hill. And people lived over these businesses, and my own wife actually worked in number 51 Barrack Street, which was called the Dairy. And there was lots of shops like that sold vegetables and groceries, and people had books, and antique, as they used to call it. They'd come in and get their messages, and they wouldn't have to pay until Friday. Everything was written into a book, and they'd come along on Friday then, and they paid what they owed, and they just carried on. That's the way people lived.
I would consider that the street was very country-like, because all the shops were farmers' daughters who didn't get a part of the farm. They were all set up in businesses in Barrack Street. I'd say the majority of the shops in Barrack Street all around us were country people who got married and were set up in grocery shops and vegetable shops and that meat, the bacon and cabbage and all those kind of shops, the ribs and all them kind of things. And they were nearly all that, apart from a lot of pubs. There was there was loads of pubs in Barrack Street. Must have been about 20 or 21. And so at night we often had fun of few fights, but of course there were only fisticuffs, and they would take down the shutters from some window and bring the fellow up home if he was after getting a few cracks of a fist or something, And we'd all be called out of bed to see that fight, because it was very exciting.
Yeah, I suppose the one that I remember most was Healy's shop, which was midway down the street, and it had everything. I mean, it had, if you were going fishing in the loch, you could buy your nets, you could buy your bait. It had footballs, it had hurleys, it had just about everything. And I think that took over from another shop that had been there previously, a similar type, one-stop shop, which would, as again, that would have been the main one. And then in latter years, I suppose Toomey shop, Breda Toomey, who was a bit of a legend of Barrack Street, would have taken over from that as well.
There was a jeweller shop actually, and another famous shop now. It was actually the Quiche de Millish. It's gone now, but it's down the bottom of Barrack Street, across from the Brown Derby pub. And if when we were 14 or 15, if we played a soccer match, we'd all come back to the Quiche de Millish, and we'd have a pint of milk and 2 cakes, and we'd be as happy as that.
And when we come out of the shop, after finishing, we'd be trying to delay inside, dropping with the milk and whatever, and we'd be looking at the window, selecting what cake we were going to have for the following Friday, But then there was the pawn shop, then Jones's pawn shop there then.
There was a shop in every house in Barrack Street. We'd never have to go into town. We would get the meat every morning for the dinner. Beautiful.
That's another man I should have mentioned actually, Richard Hinchin, because he had a famous little shop in Barrack Street across the road from Attis Chipper, and again it was a grocery shop, but he had everything there, especially at Christmas. He had the turkeys and the hams, and you got if you were a customer, you got a little present at Christmas, might be a Madeira cake or a cotton cake or a Christmas candle or whatever. But he had everything in there. And the story goes that he was a first Bears man, and he if the Bears were playing in the county final or something like that, he'd do up all the window in blue and white. And one day he put a pig's head out in the window with a cigarette in his mouth, and he had it all done up in blue and white. And this fella had a few pints in him, and he staggered into the shop. And he says, "Mr. Hinchin," he says, "is that a pig's head you have in the window?" And he said, "No, boy, that's a mirror."
One thing you have to say, there was a great camaraderie. Nobody made any great attempt to push anybody else out.
There was a shop on the other side. Maggie Manny was her name. My mother used to go down and get the meat every morning. We'd have a stew every day. But offal, I loved the offal. And we'd have crew beans.
Now you had a grocer, you had a provision shop, and you had a dairy. Now the most notable of the dairies was Carroll's, Mr. Carroll's Dairy. And the lady who ran that was Mary the Dairy. She was known as only Mary the Dairy. Now, the great thing about her is that you got your pint of milk, or your half pint, or whatever you wanted, and you could just go over to her and you could say you only wanted a cup of milk. And she'd charge you maybe a penny or a tuppence for a cup of milk. And they would have bought that milk at that earlier time in the milk market.
And so really in Barrack Street you could buy anything from a needle to a haystack. There was a shop for everything. And lovely people, and people helped one another a lot, because we all had the same, if we were short something, somebody would give you a loan of it until you needed it.
Actually, at the corner of Step Lane, there was a shop there, Julie Carroll's, it was called, and we used to go down there for Donkey's Gudge. She used to have all the cakes out in the window, in trays, and newspapers over them, but the place would be walking with flies and bees and everything. And the guy went in there one day and he asked her for a jar of honey. Well, she said, "I don't sell honey." She says, "What made you think that?" So see, when I saw all the bees out in the window, I thought you'd have honey.